007. Their isolation, they believed, brought them closer to God. But what it brought actually was madness beyond all comprehension. In the late 19th century, 3 nuns within a remote American convent committed acts so disturbing that, upon discovery, the authorities sealed the building forever. This is how faith, isolation, and delusion created one of America's most haunting mysteries. 036. Before we journey together into this darkness, I want to know from where you are listening to this story. Are you alone in your room, driving through empty roads? Tell me in the comments below. And if you are brave enough to hear what happened behind those convent walls, hit that subscribe button because, just like the travelers who knocked on Santa Vina's doors seeking shelter, once you enter this story, there is no turning back. 104. In the Appalachian Highlands of Western Virginia, the winter of 1887 arrived early, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep into the bones of every living thing. The forests grew dense and dark, their skeletal branches reaching toward gray skies that promised nothing but more snow and more silence. Nestled between 2 steep hills, invisible from the main road and accessible only by a narrow dirt path winding through ancient pines, stood the convent of Santa Vina. 139, it was a modest stone structure, built decades earlier by European missionaries who had come to America with dreams of establishing a religious community far from city corruption. The building itself was unremarkable, 2 stories of weathered gray stone, a small bell tower that no longer held a bell, and narrow windows that seemed to watch rather than welcome. 203, for years, the convent had existed on the periphery of local consciousness. The people of Millbrook, the nearest town some 8 miles away, knew of its existence, but rarely thought about it. Occasionally, travelers would mention stopping there for a night's shelter during particularly harsh weather. The nuns, they said, were quiet but hospitable, offering warm soup and a place by the fire in exchange for nothing more than a prayer. 228, but something had changed. Samuel Whitt was the first to notice. As the town's shopkeeper and unofficial keeper of community gossip, he paid attention to patterns. And the pattern that had begun to disturb him was this: people were disappearing. It started small. A drifter named Thomas Wand, who had been doing odd jobs around town, mentioned he was heading north and would likely stop at the convent for the night. 257, he never arrived at his destination. A traveling salesman, full of stories and cheap jewelry, took the forest path towards Santa Verena during a snowstorm. His wagon was found 3 days later, abandoned halfway down the trail. His horse was gone, his merchandise scattered in the snow. Then there was Margaret Finch, a widow seeking to join a religious order who had written to her sister about her intention to visit the convent. That was 6 weeks ago. 327, her sister's letters remained unanswered. Maybe they just moved on, suggested Harold Bishop, the town's blacksmith, when Samuel brought up his concerns at the general store one evening in early December. To where? Samuel countered, adjusting his spectacles. Thomas had no family, no plans beyond finding work. 348, the salesman had orders to fill in 3 different towns. He wouldn't just abandon his livelihood. And Margaret, she was devoted. If she'd been rejected by the convent, she would have written to her sister. Perhaps you're seeing shadows where there's only darkness, offered Reverend Ashford, the town's Protestant minister, a man who had always maintained an uneasy distance from the Catholic convent. 414, these are hard times. People disappear for many reasons. But Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. The convent had been home to 5 nuns when it was established in 1865. By 1875, only 3 remained: Sister Agnes, the eldest at 47, Sister Dorata, 32, and Sister Clarara, the youngest at 28. 440, the other 2 had left for other missions, or so the townspeople had been told. The 3 who remained had become increasingly reclusive over the years, venturing into town only twice a year to purchase basic supplies: salt, flour, candles, and, strangely, large quantities of lime. Sister Agnes always handled these transactions. 506, she was tall and severe, with a face that seemed carved from the same stone as the convent itself. Her eyes were pale blue, almost translucent, and they never seemed to blink. She spoke in careful, measured tones, answering questions with the minimum number of words required. There was something unsettling about her presence, a coldness that made shopkeepers uncomfortable when counting her change. 532, Sister Doratha, shorter and rounder, had a nervous quality about her. Her hands were never still, constantly adjusting her habit, touching the wooden cross that hung from her neck, picking at her fingernails until they bled. She rarely spoke at all, and when she did, her voice trembled with something that might have been fear or guilt. Sister Clarara was different. 554, there was something almost unsettling about her beauty. Dark hair that occasionally escaped from beneath her wimple. Large brown eyes that seemed to contain depths of emotion inappropriate for a woman who had taken vows of chastity and devotion. She smiled sometimes, though it never reached those eyes. 617, when she looked at people, it was as if she were studying them, cataloguing them, measuring them for some purpose no one could quite understand. The last time anyone from Millbrook had seen the three nuns was in October, when they had come for their seasonal supplies. That was 2 months ago. Samuel remembered the visit clearly because Sister Agnes had purchased an unusual amount of herbs, some medicinal, others that he didn't recognize. 646, when he'd asked about them, she'd simply said they were for purification rituals. On December 15th, a traveling priest named Father Benedict arrived in Millbrook, intending to offer Mass at the convent as part of his circuit through remote religious communities. He was a jovial man, round-faced and genuinely pious, who had served communities throughout Virginia for 20 years. 711, everyone in town knew Father Benedict. He was the kind of priest who remembered your children's names and always had a kind word. "I'll return tomorrow evening," he told Samuel as he purchased some communion wine and wafers. "The sisters will appreciate the sacrament. It's been nearly a year since they've had a priest visit." 732, I imagine they're quite lonely up there. But Father Benedict did not return the next evening or the evening after that. On the third day, Samuel organized a search party. 12 men, including Reverend Ashford and the town's constable, Martin Drake, rode out to the convent through knee-deep snow. The journey took 3 hours in the bitter cold, the horses struggling through drifts that seemed determined to keep them away. 759, what they found was silence. The convent stood as it always had, its stone walls dark against the white landscape. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone was inside. But when the men called out and knocked on the heavy wooden door, there was no response. "Perhaps they're at prayer," suggested one of the men. 819, they might not answer during devotions. But the silence felt different. It felt deliberate. It felt like something was being hidden. Constable Drake knocked again, harder this time, his voice rising. "This is the law. Open the door. We're looking for Father Benedict." Still nothing. The men walked around the building, peering through windows. 843, the curtains were drawn in every room, but through small gaps they could see movement, shadows passing back and forth, deliberate and unhurried. Someone was definitely inside, and they were deliberately not answering. At the back of the convent, they found the small cemetery where previous residents had been buried. The graves were neat and well maintained, though something seemed off. 907, there were more graves than there should have been, far more than could be accounted for by the 5 nuns who had originally lived there and the 2 who had supposedly left for other missions. "How many graves are here?" Samuel asked, beginning to count. Harold Bishop, walking among the headstones, called back, "At least 15, maybe more under this snow." 931, a chill ran through the group that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "We could force entry," Drake said finally, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "But breaking down a convent door? That's serious business. We need proper authority." "A man is missing," Samuel insisted. "Several people are missing. Whatever religious protocols exist, they don't override human life." 957, but Reverend Ashford shook his head. "Give them 1 more day. Perhaps they've fallen ill and can't come to the door. We'll return tomorrow with proper legal authority, a written order from Judge Morrison." Reluctantly, the men agreed, and rode back to Millbrook as the sun began to set, turning the snow-covered forest into a landscape of shadows and whispered fears. 1023, but as they departed, Samuel looked back at the convent one last time. In an upper window, he could swear he saw a face, pale, unmoving, watching them leave with those translucent blue eyes. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the graves. Too many graves. And he kept remembering something Sister Agnes had said during her last visit to his store, something that hadn't seemed important at the time. The flesh is weak, Mr. Whit. 1053, but it can be made strong through sacrifice. Everything can be made pure if you're willing to do what others won't. At the time he thought she was speaking metaphorically about religious devotion. Now, in the darkness of his bedroom, those words took on a much more sinister meaning. Something was very wrong at Santa Vina, and whatever it was had been hidden for far too long. 11:19, morning arrived grey and bitter. Samuel stood at his shop window, watching the empty street as a new snowfall began. He hadn't slept more than an hour, his mind churning with dark possibilities that he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. Constable Drake appeared at 9 o'clock, a folded document in his gloved hand. Judge Morrison signed the order. 11:41, we can enter the convent legally now. His face was grim. I sent word to the county seat. If we find what I think we might find, we'll need more than 12 townsmen. This time, 15 men made the journey to Santa Verena. They brought tools, axes, crowbars, rope. They brought lanterns, though it was midday, and they brought weapons, though none of them wanted to acknowledge why. 12:07, the convent looked different in daylight. The smoke from the chimney had stopped. The building seemed even more isolated, as if it had somehow moved further from the world of normal things during the night. The snow around it was undisturbed, no footprints leading in or out, as if the building existed in its own frozen bubble of time. 12:29, once again, their knocking went unanswered. We're coming in, Drake shouted, his voice echoing off the hills. By legal authority, we're entering these premises. He nodded to Harold Bishop, who approached the door with an axe. The first blow rang out like a gunshot in the still air. The second splintered the wood. On the fifth blow, the door burst inward, and a wave of cold air rushed out to meet them. 12:54, cold that was somehow different from the winter cold outside, carrying with it a smell that made several men step back involuntarily. It wasn't the smell of death exactly. It was something medicinal and sweet with an undertone of incense and herbs and something else, something organic that shouldn't have been there. 13:15, the entrance hall was neat and clean. A small table held a Bible and a wooden cross. The stone floor had been recently swept. Everything appeared normal, almost aggressively so, as if someone had carefully arranged the space to appear undisturbed. Split into groups, Drake ordered quietly. 13:38, search every room, and for God's sake, be careful. The first floor revealed a strange contradiction. A kitchen with dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, so many herbs that the ceiling was barely visible. A pot of what looked like vegetable soup sat on the cold stove, though, when one of the men stirred it, he found it had an unusual bitter smell. 2 p.m., the dining room had a table set for 3 with plates that showed recent use but had been meticulously cleaned. But it was the chapel that made everyone pause. The room was immaculate with wooden pews polished to a shine and an altar decorated with candlesticks and a statue of the Virgin Mary. But someone had arranged the candles in a pattern that didn't match any Christian tradition anyone recognized. 14:27, and on the altar, partially hidden behind the statue, was a leather-bound book that wasn't a Bible. Samuel picked it up carefully. The cover was unmarked, but when he opened it, he found pages filled with dense, cramped handwriting in Latin and English. Diagrams, symbols, theological arguments that twisted scripture into shapes it was never meant to take. 14:52, what is it? Drake asked. I don't know, Samuel replied, his voice shaking. But it's not right. None of this is right. Upstairs, someone called. You need to see this. The second floor held 6 small rooms, cells really, each barely large enough for a bed, a small table, and a chair. 5 were open and empty, their beds neatly made with military precision. 15:17, but 3 doors at the end of the hallway were different. These doors had heavy iron bolts on the outside. The bolts were locked. Jesus Christ, whispered Reverend Ashford, making the sign of the cross despite his Protestant faith. Drake approached the first door and slid the bolt open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent hallway. 15:39, The hinges creaked as he pushed it inward. Sister Agnes knelt in the center of the cell, her back to the door, perfectly still. She was praying, her voice a low murmur that sent chills down the spines of every man present. She didn't turn around when they entered. She didn't acknowledge their presence at all. 1602, her voice continued in steady Latin, the words of prayers twisted into something that didn't sound quite like worship anymore. Sister Agnes, Drake said carefully. We need you to come with us. Father Benedict is missing. We need to ask you some questions. She continued praying, her voice never wavering, never pausing. 2 men carefully approached and lifted her to her feet. 1627, she didn't resist, but she also didn't help. Her body was rigid, her eyes fixed on something invisible in front of her, and when they turned her around, those pale blue eyes looked asterisk through asterisk them rather than at them, as if they were transparent, as if they didn't exist at all. They led her downstairs and seated her in the dining room under guard. 1651, she immediately began praying again, rocking slightly, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. The second cell held Sister Dorata. She was sitting on her bed, staring at her hands with an expression of profound horror. Her fingernails were destroyed, torn away or bitten down to bloody stumps. 1714, when the men entered, she looked up at them with eyes so filled with guilt and terror that several of the men had to look away. We were so hungry, she whispered, her voice breaking. We were so hungry, and Sister Agnes said, she said it was God's will. She said we were being tested. She said, where is Father Benedict? Drake demanded. 1735, Sister Doratha began to weep. Great shaking sobs that wrecked her entire body. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We didn't mean. She said it was holy. She said we were becoming pure. They brought her downstairs as well, though she could barely walk. She collapsed into a chair next to Sister Agnes and immediately began praying too, though her prayers were interspersed with whispered apologies to people who weren't there. 1759, the third cell was Sister Clarara's. When Drake opened the door, she was standing by the window, looking out at the forest with her hands folded calmly in front of her. Unlike the others, she turned to face them immediately, and she smiled. Not a warm smile, but something calculating, something that suggested she had been expecting them, that she had perhaps even been looking forward to this moment. 1828, you found us, she said softly, her voice clear and steady. I knew you would eventually. I told Sister Agnes that we couldn't hide forever, but she was convinced that God would protect us. God, it seems, had other plans. Where is Father Benedict? Drake's voice was harder now, more demanding. Sister Clarara's smile didn't waver. 1849, that depends on what you mean by where. His body, his soul, his essence. She paused, tilting her head slightly. You'll find evidence of him, certainly. Whether you find him as you remember him, that's a different question entirely. The room seemed to grow colder. Samuel felt his stomach turn over. 1910, show us, Drake commanded. Sister Clarara nodded gracefully, as if she had just been asked to give a tour of the garden. Of course, though I should warn you, what you're about to see will change how you understand the world. Some knowledge, once gained, can never be forgotten. She led them downstairs, moving with calm dignity, her chains clinking softly with each step. 1933, the other men followed, weapons drawn, though what they were preparing to defend against, they couldn't have said. In the kitchen, Sister Clarara paused by what appeared to be a solid wall. She pressed a particular stone, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing stairs that descended into darkness. The root cellar, she explained, though we used it for purposes somewhat different from storing vegetables. 2001, Drake took a lantern and descended first. Samuel followed, though every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave this place, to ride away and never speak of it again. The cellar was larger than expected, carved out of the hillside beneath the convent, and what they found there would become the source of nightmares for every man present for the rest of their lives. 2023, the space had been converted into something between a laboratory and a chapel. Religious icons covered the walls, but mixed among them were diagrams of human anatomy, charts tracking phases of the moon, and writings in multiple languages. There were jars filled with herbs and powders. There were tools that might have been medical instruments or might have been something else entirely. 2048, and there were the barrels, large wooden barrels sealed with wax, lined one wall. Drake approached the nearest one and carefully broke the seal. The smell that emerged was overwhelming. Salt and lime and decay. Inside, preserved in the brine, were remains that confirmed everyone's worst fears. "Dear God," someone whispered behind Samuel. 2114, they found Father Benedict's vestments folded carefully in a corner, cleaned and pressed as if ready for the next Mass. They found personal items belonging to the missing travelers, a pocket watch, a wedding ring, a small Bible with a woman's name inscribed inside. They found journals documenting years of careful planning, theological justifications, and meticulous record-keeping. 2139, but most disturbing of all was what they found on a makeshift altar at the far end of the cellar. Sister Agnes's diary, bound in leather, filled with thousands of pages of dense writing that outlined a philosophy so twisted, so divorced from any recognizable theology, that reading it felt like looking directly into madness itself. 2201, Sister Clarara watched them discover everything with that same calm smile. Sister Agnes believed, she explained, her voice echoing in the stone chamber, that the ultimate act of faith was to transcend the limitations of mortal flesh. She developed a theology of purification through consumption. The idea that by taking into ourselves the physical essence of others, we could absorb their spiritual energy, refine it, and use it to elevate our own souls toward divinity. 2234, Audrey, "That's not theology," Reverend Ashford said, his voice shaking. "That's insanity." "Is it?" Sister Clarara tilted her head, genuinely curious. "The Eucharist teaches that we consume the body of Christ." Sister Agnes simply extended that logic. If consuming the divine brings us closer to God, why wouldn't consuming the earthly help us transcend earthly limitations? She found precedents in medieval mysticism, in the practices of ancient saints, in texts the Church chose to suppress rather than destroy. "You murdered people, Drake." 2313, said flatly. "We accepted what God provided," Sister Clarara corrected gently. "We never went out hunting for victims. We simply received those who came to us. Travelers seeking shelter, lost souls looking for guidance. They came to our door of their own free will, and we gave them purpose. We transformed their meaningless wandering into something transcendent." 2339, the men stood in horrified silence, trying to process what they were hearing. Not just the admission of crimes, but the complete absence of remorse, the twisted logic that had somehow made these acts seem not just acceptable, but holy. "How many?" Samuel finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sister Clarara considered the question. 2400 hours 02, I stopped counting after the first year. Sister Agnes kept meticulous records. You'll find them in her diary. But if I had to guess, 20, 25. We've been here a long time, and winters are long in these mountains. The 3 nuns were taken into custody and transported to the county jail in Harrison Springs, 30 miles from Millbrook. 2400 hours 24, news of their crimes spread with terrifying speed. And within days, journalists from Richmond, Washington, and even New York descended on the rural Virginia county, all desperate to understand how something so horrific could have happened in a place of supposed worship. The case was unprecedented. Female criminals were rare enough in the 1880s. 2400 hours 46, female religious criminals were almost unheard of, and the nature of their crimes, systematic murder justified through elaborate theological delusion, carried out over years in complete isolation, captured the horrified fascination of the entire nation. The trial began in February 1888, conducted in the largest courtroom available, which still couldn't accommodate all who wished to attend. 25:15, security was heavy as several families of the victims had made threats against the prisoners. The courtroom was packed with journalists, curious onlookers, and family members seeking answers that might help them understand the incomprehensible. Sister Agnes, Sister Doratha, and Sister Clarara sat together in the defendant's box, dressed not in their habits, but in simple grey dresses provided by the jail. 25:40, they could not have looked more different from each other. Sister Agnes maintained her rigid posture and expressionless face throughout the proceedings. She stared straight ahead, her pale eyes unblinking, occasionally moving her lips in what appeared to be silent prayer. She had lost significant weight during her imprisonment, her face becoming even more skull-like, her hands skeletal where they rested in her lap. 26:06, Sister Dorata wept constantly, her hands, bandaged to hide her destroyed fingernails, clutched a rosary that the court had permitted her to keep. She rocked slightly in her seat, murmuring apologies to no one in particular. Sometimes she would call out names, Thomas, Margaret, Father Benedict, and dissolve into fresh sobs. 26:29, Sister Clarara looked directly at the jury, at the spectators, at the judge. Her expression was calm, almost curious, as if she were observing a fascinating academic exercise rather than facing prosecution for multiple murders. When people met her eyes, they felt a chill. There was intelligence there, and awareness. 26:52, but something fundamental was missing, something that made her human in a way everyone else understood. The prosecutor, District Attorney James Thornton, was a man in his 50s who had handled many difficult cases, but had never encountered anything like this. He opened his argument with deliberate simplicity. These three women committed acts of depravity so profound that they challenge our understanding of human nature. 27:20, they lured travelers to their convent under the guise of Christian charity. They drugged them with doctored food or drink, rendering them unconscious. They ended their lives. And then he paused, letting the silence build. And then they committed acts that I cannot describe in this courtroom without violating public decency. Acts that violated every law of God and man. 27:45, acts that they justified through a theology so twisted that it bears no resemblance to any Christian doctrine. He presented evidence systematically. The remains found in the cellar, identified where possible through personal effects or testimony from family members. The journals read aloud in carefully edited portions to a courtroom that sat in stunned silence. 28:09, the testimony of townspeople who described the disappearances, the patterns, the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. Dr. Emerson Walsh, the county coroner, testified about the remains. The evidence suggests systematic planning over an extended period. The preservation methods used were sophisticated, indicating knowledge of chemistry and anatomy. 28:35, based on the remains we recovered and the records we found, we can confirm at least 17 victims. The actual number may be higher. When asked about the cause of death, Dr. Walsh's voice wavered. Most victims appeared to have been poisoned with a mixture of herbs that induced deep unconsciousness followed by respiratory failure. 28:59, it would have been relatively painless if that provides any comfort to the families. The courtroom erupted in horrified murmurs. Judge Morrison had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. The defense attorney, a man named Silas Crawford, who had been appointed by the court after no one would voluntarily take the case, built his strategy around insanity. 29:23, he argued that the three women had fallen into a shared psychosis, a religious mania that divorced them from reality. These women are not evil, Crawford argued, though his voice lacked conviction. They are profoundly ill. Look at Sister Agnes. Can you truly say that woman is in her right mind? Look at Sister Dorotha, who has mutilated herself out of guilt and confusion. 29:48, these are not the actions of criminals. These are the actions of people whose minds have been broken by isolation and religious extremism. He called Dr. Howard Brennan, a physician who specialized in disorders of the mind, to testify. Religious mania is well documented, Dr. Brennan explained. When individuals become isolated and fixate intensely on religious texts, they can develop delusions that seem entirely logical within their distorted framework. 30:21, Sister Agnes created an elaborate theological justification for their actions. To her, they were not committing crimes. They were performing sacred rituals. In her mind, she was serving God, not defying him. And the others? Crawford asked. Sister Dorata and Sister Clarara? In isolated communities, especially religious ones, there is often a dominant personality that shapes the beliefs of others. 30:49, Sister Agnes was older, more educated in theology, more forceful in her convictions. She likely convinced the younger women that her visions were genuine revelations. Sister Doratha clearly suffers from profound guilt, suggesting she retained some awareness that their actions were wrong. Sister Clarara, he paused. 31:14, Sister Clarara is more complex. But then came the cross-examination. Dr. Brennan, Thornton said, approaching the witness stand with Sister Clarara's confiscated diary in hand. You say these women didn't know right from wrong. But this diary describes in detail the process of drugging their victims so they wouldn't suffer. 31:34, it discusses choosing poisons that would be quick and painless. It describes elaborate precautions to avoid detection. Do those sound like the actions of someone who doesn't understand what they're doing? Dr. Brennan hesitated. Understanding the practical mechanics of an act is different from understanding its moral dimension. 31:56, Sister Agnes wrote that they were careful to never leave evidence in town. They maintained completely normal appearances during their visits. They created false graves in the cemetery to hide their crimes. They burned personal effects to prevent identification. Does that sound like insanity to you, Doctor, or does it sound like deliberate concealment? The question hung in the air. Dr. Brennan had no good answer. 32:24, let me read you something else, Thornton continued, opening Sister Agnes' diary to a marked page. This is from an entry dated June 1883. We must be cautious. If discovered, no one will understand the sacred nature of our work. They will call us monsters. Therefore, we must ensure we are never discovered. 32:47, we must be cunning as serpents, innocent as doves. Does that sound like someone divorced from reality, Doctor? No, Dr. Brennan admitted quietly. It doesn't. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The defendants would be permitted to speak. Sister Doratha was first. She could barely stand, her legs shaking as she approached the witness stand. 33:10, her voice was so soft that the judge had to ask her twice to speak louder. I knew it was wrong, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. In my heart, I always knew. But Sister Agnes, she made it sound like we were doing God's work. She read from scriptures and old texts. And she said that the early saints had performed similar acts of devotion. 33:32, she said our suffering was proof of our holiness. That ordinary people couldn't understand what we were accomplishing. When did you realize you were committing crimes? Thornton asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Sister Doratha's face crumpled. The first time. The very first time. I became physically ill. I begged Sister Agnes to stop. 33:55, told her we were committing mortal sins. But she said I was weak, that my body was rejecting the work because my soul wasn't pure enough yet. She made me fast for 3 days, made me pray for hours without sleeping, and eventually I was too tired to resist, too isolated to remember what was real and what wasn't. 34:16, then why didn't you leave? Why didn't you go to the authorities? Where would I go? Sister Doratha looked up, her eyes red and swollen. I had taken vows. The convent was my whole life. I had no money, no family who would take me in. And Sister Agnes said that if we ever told anyone, we would all hang. She said that even if we repented, no one would believe we'd been trying to serve God. 34:43, we would just be monsters to the world. She sobbed. She was right. Sister Agnes refused to testify. When called to the stand, she stood and spoke directly to the judge, her voice clear and unwavering. I have nothing to say to this court. You judge me by laws of man which are temporary and flawed. I answer to a higher authority. History will vindicate us. 35:09, future generations, when they have evolved beyond their current spiritual limitations, will understand what we were attempting to achieve. A transcendence of flesh, a purification of spirit through acts that lesser minds cannot comprehend. Judge Morrison's expression was stone. Sit down, Sister Agnes. 35:33, I will not sit, she replied calmly. I will stand before God's judgment as I have always stood, upright, unrepentant, and certain of my righteousness. You may kill my body, but you cannot diminish what we accomplished. We touched something divine, something beyond your comprehension. Remove her, the judge ordered. 35:54, and guards had to physically force Sister Agnes back to her seat. Even then, she continued speaking, her voice rising in Latin prayers that sounded more like curses than devotions. But it was Sister Clarara's testimony that truly shook the courtroom. She approached the stand calmly, took her oath without hesitation, and sat with her hands folded in her lap like a school teacher about to deliver a lecture. 36:21, I want to be clear about something, she began, her voice steady and thoughtful. I am not insane. Neither is Sister Agnes, despite what she wants you to believe. We knew exactly what we were doing, and we did it deliberately with full understanding of the consequences. The courtroom erupted. Crawford, her own attorney, looked stricken, but Sister Clarara continued calmly. 36:47, Sister Agnes developed a theology, yes, an elaborate justification for our actions. But I didn't need her theology. I participated because she paused, seeming to search for the right words, because I wanted to understand something that most people never question: the nature of life and death, the meaning of sacrifice, what happens when you cross lines that society says must never be crossed. 37:15, are you saying you felt no remorse? Thornton asked carefully. Sister Clarara considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness. Remorse suggests regret. Regret suggests you wish you had made different choices. I don't wish that. I'm curious about what we did. I'm interested in understanding why it affected me so little. But remorse? No. 37:40, they were strangers. They meant nothing to me personally. And honestly, most of them were already suffering, poor, homeless, traveling in dangerous weather with no real destination. We ended their suffering. In a way, we gave their deaths more meaning than their lives had. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. 38:01, you're a monster, someone shouted from the gallery. Sister Clarara turned to look at the speaker with mild interest. Perhaps. But tell me, how many of you have eaten meat without thinking about the animal that died? How many of you wear clothing made by workers in conditions you'd find horrific if you actually witnessed them? How many of you benefit every day from suffering you choose not to see? The only difference between us is that I'm aware of the cost and I don't pretend otherwise. I'm honest about what I am. 38:32, you simply refuse to look in the mirror. Judge Morrison pounded his gavel. That's enough. Remove the defendant from the stand. As Sister Clarara was led away, she paused by the jury box. She looked at each juror in turn, her gaze thoughtful and penetrating. You'll convict us, she said quietly, and you'll feel righteous doing it. 38:58, but years from now, when you can't sleep, you'll wonder if I was entirely wrong. You'll wonder if the only real difference between us is simply honesty. Sleep well with that thought, gentlemen. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 47 minutes. When they returned, every face was pale, every expression carefully neutral, as if they were afraid that showing too much emotion might somehow implicate them in the horror they had witnessed. 39:26, Judge Morrison read the verdict himself, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom. On 17 counts of murder in the first degree, we find the defendants, Sister Agnes Whitmore, Sister Dorothea Finch, and Sister Clarara Brennan, guilty on all counts. There was no cheering, no celebration. The crimes were too horrific, too incomprehensible for anyone to feel satisfaction. 39:52, there was only a heavy silence broken by Sister Dorothea's sobbing and the sound of someone in the gallery being sick. Sentencing came 2 days later. Judge Morrison addressed each defendant individually, and his words would be quoted in newspapers across the nation. To Sister Agnes, you twisted faith into justification for unspeakable acts. 40:17, you used your position of trust and your knowledge of theology to prey upon the vulnerable and to corrupt 2 younger women who should have been under your spiritual guidance. You will be executed for your crimes, and may God have mercy on your soul, though I suspect he will find it difficult. 40:38, Sister Agnes showed no reaction. She simply closed her eyes and moved her lips in prayer, the same Latin phrases she had been repeating for weeks. To Sister Doratha, you participated in horrors that defy description, but the court recognizes that you were manipulated and dominated by a stronger, more corrupt personality. Your remorse appears genuine. 41:03, however, your guilt is not absolved by your tears. You knew these acts were wrong, yet you continued. You will be executed for your crimes. Sister Doratha collapsed, sobbing so violently that guards had to carry her from the courtroom, her cries echoing through the halls long after the doors closed behind her. 41:27, to Sister Clarara, you are perhaps the most disturbing individual I have encountered in 30 years on the bench. You possess full understanding of right and wrong. Yet you choose wrong with clear eyes and a sound mind. You show no remorse, no guilt, no recognition of the humanity of your victims. That makes you not insane, but something far more dangerous. 41:51, you will be executed for your crimes, and I pray that your death will bring some measure of peace to the families you have devastated. Sister Clarara smiled slightly. Thank you, Your Honor, for at least recognizing what I am. Most people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The executions were scheduled for March 23, 1888, to be carried out at the county prison at dawn. 42:15, in the weeks leading up to the execution, the three women received very different sorts of attention from the outside world. Sister Agnes received no visitors. She spent her time in solitary prayer, refusing all human contact except what was absolutely necessary. Guards reported that she would kneel in the center of her cell for hours, reciting Latin prayers in a continuous whisper that never seemed to stop, not even when she slept. She barely ate. 42:46, by the time of her execution, she had become skeletal, her already severe features sharpened into something that looked barely human. Sister Doratha received visits from her younger sister, Catherine, who had been among the first to raise concerns about Margaret Finch's disappearance. Catherine was a kind woman in her 30s, married to a farmer with 3 small children who had loved their Aunt Doratha before they learned what she had done. 43:15, the visits were heartbreaking. Sister Doratha would weep and apologize, begging her sister for forgiveness that Catherine struggled to give. I want to forgive you, Catherine said during their final visit, her own eyes red from crying. I want to believe you were sick, that you were deceived. But Margaret, she was my friend. Her children are orphans now. 43:39, Thomas Wayland worked on our farm for 2 months. He was a good man, quiet and kind. How can I forgive you for what happened to them? I can't ask you to forgive me, Sister Doratha whispered. I can't even forgive myself. I see their faces every night. Every time I close my eyes, they're there asking me why, and I have no answer that makes sense. 44:03, then why? Catherine demanded, her voice breaking. Why did you keep doing it if you knew it was wrong? Because I was afraid, Sister Doratha admitted. Afraid of Sister Agnes. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of facing what we'd already done. Once you start down a path like that, once you've crossed that line, you can't go back. 44:26, you can only go forward or stay frozen in place. And I was too weak to do either. Sister Clarara received the most unusual visitor of all, a journalist from New York named William Ashford, no relation to Reverend Ashford from Millbrook. He was writing a book about the case and wanted to interview all 3 women before their executions. 44:48, Sister Agnes refused to speak with him. Sister Doratha tried but could barely form coherent sentences through her crying. But Sister Clarara welcomed him with what seemed like genuine pleasure. Finally, she said when he arrived, someone who wants to understand rather than just condemn. 45:10, over 3 visits, she spoke with him for a total of 7 hours. The conversations were disturbing, and Ashford would later admit that transcribing his notes left him unable to sleep for weeks. Sister Clarara spoke about her childhood normal, even happy, in a small town in Pennsylvania. She described joining the convent at age 20, seeking purpose and community after her parents died. 45:37, She talked about the slow decay of the religious order as members left and were not replaced, until only the three of them remained. We were forgotten, she explained. The church hierarchy never visited. No one checked on us. We were so isolated that we might as well have been on another planet. And in that isolation, something changed. 46:00, or maybe it was always there, and the isolation just gave it permission to emerge. When did the crime start? Ashford asked. Winter of 1881. A man came to our door during a blizzard, half frozen, barely conscious. Sister Agnes gave him soup with herbs to help him sleep. He never woke up. At first, I thought she had made a mistake with the dosage, but then she started talking about it as if it had been intentional, as if it had been a test from God. 46:34, and she developed this whole theology around it, about purification, about transcendence, about using physical acts to achieve spiritual elevation. And you believed her? Sister Clara smiled. I didn't need to believe her theology. I was simply curious. What does it feel like to have that kind of power over another human being? What happens when you cross a line that society says must never be crossed? And once I knew, I couldn't unknow it. 47:04, the experience changed how I understood the world. But the victims, Ashford pressed, their families, the suffering you caused. I feel as much for them as you feel for the pig that became your breakfast this morning, Sister Clara replied calmly. Which is to say, nothing. You've accepted that some lives have less value than others. So have I. 47:26, we just disagree on which lives matter. Ashford left that final interview feeling physically ill. When his book was published later that year, these conversations would be heavily edited, with entire sections removed because publishers feared they were too disturbing for public consumption. March 23 arrived cold and grey. 47:50, the three women were prepared for execution at dawn, dressed in identical plain dresses with simple head coverings. No religious symbols were permitted. A crowd had gathered outside the prison, family members of victims, curious onlookers, journalists from across the country. The mood was somber rather than celebratory. 48:12, there was no sense of justice being served, only a collective need to see this nightmare end. Sister Agnes walked to the gallows with her head high, still praying in Latin. When asked if she had any final words, she said only, "We served God according to our understanding. If we were wrong, He will judge us." 48:34, but we did not act from cruelty. We acted from devotion. Let history remember that. The hood was placed over her head. The noose tightened around her neck. When the trapdoor opened, she fell silently, her neck breaking instantly. Her body swung for a moment, then was still. Even in death, her lips seemed to move as if continuing prayers in whatever place she had gone. 48:59, Sister Doratha could not walk. She had to be carried, sobbing and praying, begging God and the victims' families for forgiveness that would never come. Her final words were barely audible. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. Please." The executioner was as gentle as he could be. She died quickly. 49:21, her suffering, at least her physical suffering, ended in seconds. Sister Clara walked calmly, almost serenely. She looked at the small crowd of witnesses with interest, as if memorizing their faces. When asked for final words, she paused thoughtfully. "I want you all to remember something. You think you're different from me. 49:43, you think you're civilized, moral, good. But circumstances shape us all. Isolation, hunger, fear, desperation. These things reveal who we really are beneath the masks we wear. I simply had the courage to look in that mirror. Most of you will spend your lives running from it, but it's always there, waiting. 50:06, and someday, in your darkest moment, you'll understand what I'm saying." The hood was placed over her head. There was a moment of complete silence, broken only by the wind moving through the prison yard. The trapdoor opened, the rope went taut, and Sister Clara died without making a sound. 50:26, her final message hanging in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. After the executions, the question remained, What to do with the convent of Santa Vina? The Catholic diocese immediately disavowed the building and everyone who had lived there. The bishop issued a lengthy statement declaring that the three women had acted completely outside church doctrine and that their actions represented a perversion of faith, not an expression of it. 50:55, they were not nuns in any meaningful sense, the statement read. They were criminals who hid behind religious symbols to justify depravity. The Church condemns them absolutely and prays for the souls of their victims. But condemnation didn't solve the practical problem of the building itself. Some townspeople wanted it burned to the ground, the earth salted, every trace of its existence erased from memory. 51:23, others argued it should be preserved as a warning, a reminder of what could happen when faith twisted into fanaticism. There were even a few who suggested it be converted into a hospital or school, as if ordinary use could somehow cleanse it of its dark history. In the end, the decision was made to seal it. The doors and windows were boarded shut with heavy planks. 51:48, chains and padlocks were installed on every entrance. A fence was erected around the property with signs warning against trespassing. The path leading to the convent was allowed to grow over, gradually becoming impassable as the forest reclaimed what had been cleared. But sealing a building doesn't erase memory. 52:10, and the story of what happened at Santa Vina spread far beyond rural Virginia. Samuel Hewitt, the shopkeeper who had first noticed the pattern of disappearances, never fully recovered from what he had seen in that cellar. He sold his store within a year and moved to Ohio with his wife, hoping distance would help him forget. It didn't. He died in 1902, and his widow reported that he had nightmares until the very end. 52:38, dreams of pale blue eyes watching him from shadows, of voices praying in languages he didn't understand, of a cold that seeped into his bones no matter how many blankets he used. Constable Drake became withdrawn and somber after the investigation. He continued his work for another decade, but those who knew him said he was never quite the same. He rarely smiled. 53:01, he spoke less, and he developed a habit of staring at people's hands when he met them, as if looking for bloodstains that only he could see. Reverend Ashford left Millbrook in 1890 to take a position at a church in Richmond. In his farewell sermon, he spoke about the nature of evil, not as something supernatural or distant, but as something that could grow in isolation, in the absence of community, in the silence that came when people stopped caring about each other. 53:31, evil doesn't announce itself with horns and pitchforks, he said. It comes quietly in small compromises, in rationalizations, in the gradual erosion of human connection. Those women weren't demons. They were people who got lost in the darkness. And there was no one there to bring them back into the light. 53:52, the families of the victims struggled in different ways. Some found comfort in faith, believing their loved ones were in heaven despite the horrible manner of their deaths. Others lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile a loving God with what had been allowed to happen. A few became obsessed with the case, visiting the sealed convent repeatedly, standing outside the fence and staring at the boarded windows as if they might find answers there. 54:22, Margaret Finch's sister, Catherine, commissioned a memorial stone in the Millbrook Cemetery. It bore the names of all 17 confirmed victims, with space left blank for the others who were suspected but never identified. The inscription read simply, "They sought shelter and found death. May they find peace in the arms of God." 54:47, the convent became the subject of local legends. People reported seeing lights in the windows despite the building being sealed and empty. Some claimed to hear singing on winter nights, 3 female voices harmonizing in prayers that sounded wrong somehow, twisted, as if the words were being sung backwards. Teenagers dared each other to approach the fence, to touch the padlocked gates, to call out challenges to whatever might be inside. 55:15, most got no further than the edge of the property before losing their nerve. But a few claimed to have felt something, a cold that had nothing to do with weather, a presence that watched from the darkness, a sense that they were not welcome and should leave immediately. The journalist William Ashford published his book, The Santa Verena Tragedy, a study in religious madness in 1889. 55:42, it became a bestseller, though many found it too disturbing to finish. The conversations with Sister Clarara were included, though heavily edited, and they sparked fierce debates about the nature of evil, the limits of free will, and whether someone like Sister Clarara could truly be considered human in any moral sense. 56:02, one philosopher wrote in response, Sister Clarara forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that consciousness and conscience are not the same thing. She was fully conscious, fully aware, fully intelligent. But something that should have been there, some connection to other human beings, some natural revulsion at causing suffering, was simply absent. 56:27, whether this was something she was born without or something she lost in the isolation of that convent, we may never know. But her existence challenges our assumption that all human beings share a common moral foundation. The debate continued in academic circles for years, with Sister Clarara becoming a case study in psychology, philosophy, and theology. 56:51, was she evil? Was she ill? Was she simply honest about impulses that others successfully suppressed? The questions had no clear answers. By 1900, most people in Millbrook tried not to think about the convent anymore. New families moved to town who had never heard the story. Children grew up without learning what had happened in the hills above their homes. 57:16, the sealed building slowly decayed, its stone walls cracking, its roof beginning to collapse, nature gradually reclaiming what humans had abandoned. But occasionally, on winter nights, when the wind howled through the mountains, someone would remember. They would think about 3 women living in complete isolation, gradually losing their connection to humanity, constructing elaborate justifications for acts that defied comprehension. 57:42, they would wonder what it had been like in that convent during those final weeks when the women must have known discovery was inevitable, when they locked themselves in their cells and prayed to a God who had either abandoned them or never existed in the way they believed. In 1923, the fence around the convent was torn down by a storm. 58:05, no one bothered to replace it. The building was barely visible anymore, swallowed by the forest that had grown up around it. The path was gone entirely, and even hunters who knew the area avoided that section of the hills. It had a feeling about it, they said, a wrongness that made animals nervous and men uneasy. 58:27, a historical society in Virginia attempted to document the site in 1947, thinking it might have value as a dark tourism destination. They managed to get close enough to photograph the exterior, but none of the researchers were willing to enter the building, even with the doors long since rotted away. The photos showed stone walls covered in vines, windows like empty eye sockets, and a doorway that seemed to lead into absolute darkness. 58:58, the project was quietly abandoned. Today, the convent of Santa Verena exists mostly in archives and academic papers. The building itself has likely collapsed entirely, reclaimed by the earth like a secret the land wants to forget. The cemetery was excavated in 1952 and the remains of victims were given proper burials with their families when possible. 59:22, but the story persists. It persists because it asks questions that make us uncomfortable. Questions about how well we really know the people around us. Questions about what happens to the human mind in complete isolation. Questions about whether faith can become toxic, whether devotion can become delusion, whether the language of religion can be twisted to justify anything at all. 59:48, Sister Agnes died believing she had served God. Sister Doratha died drowning in guilt, but still unable to fully understand how she had participated in such horrors. And Sister Clarara died with a smile, secure in her belief that she had simply been more honest than the rest of humanity about the darkness that exists in all of us. 1 hour and 11 seconds, were they evil? Were they insane? Were they victims of circumstances that would have broken anyone? Samuel Hewitt spent the last years of his life trying to answer those questions. In his final letter to Constable Drake, written just weeks before his death, he wrote, "I have thought about those women every day for 15 years. 1 hour and 33 seconds, I have tried to understand them, tried to find some explanation that makes sense, but I keep coming back to one simple truth. They were human, just like us. They ate and slept and prayed and lived. And somehow, in that isolated place, with no one watching, with no connection to the wider world, their humanity became something else. Something that looked human but wasn't. 1 hour and 58 seconds, not in any way that matters. The scariest part isn't that such people exist. The scariest part is wondering if any of us, under the right circumstances, could become them. If isolation and hunger and fear and fanaticism could reshape any human soul into something that doesn't recognize other human souls as real. I don't have an answer. 1 hour 1 minute and 22 seconds, I just know that when I saw Sister Clara smile in that courtroom, I saw something that understood me better than I understood myself. And that terrified me more than anything else. The idea that maybe she was right. Maybe the only difference between us was that she had the courage to look in the mirror, and I spent my life running from it. 1 hour 1 minute and 44 seconds, the letter ended there, unsigned, as if Samuel had died before he could finish his thought. The ruins of Santa Verena remained somewhere in those Virginia hills, hidden by decades of forest growth, marked on no modern maps. Local historians know approximately where it stood, but few have any interest in locating it precisely. 1 hour 2 minutes and 8 seconds, some places, they say, are better left forgotten. But on winter nights, when the wind moves through the mountains and the snow falls heavy and silent, people in Millbrook sometimes wake from dreams they can't quite remember. Dreams of 3 women in a stone building, praying in a language that sounds almost like Latin but isn't quite. 1 hour 2 minutes and 29 seconds, preparing meals from ingredients that should not exist, believing with absolute certainty that they are serving a God who does not answer. And in those moments between sleep and waking, the question remains, were Sister Agnes, Sister Doratha, and Sister Clara monsters? Or were they simply human beings who got lost in the darkness and found, instead of their way back to light, a deeper darkness that made sense to them in ways nothing else ever had? The answer, like the ruins of the convent itself, remains buried in the cold Virginia hills, waiting for someone. 1 hour 3 minutes and 5 seconds, brave or foolish enough to dig it up. But perhaps some truths are better left buried. Perhaps some questions should never be answered. Perhaps the real horror of Santa Vina isn't what happened there, but what it reveals about all of us. That under the right circumstances, in the right isolation, with the right justifications, any human being might discover they're capable of anything at all. 1 hour 3 minutes and 34 seconds, and that, more than any ghost story, is what keeps people awake at night. This story was inspired by historical cases of religious extremism and isolation. But the characters and specific events are fictional. The tale serves as a reminder of the dangers of fanaticism, isolation, and the human capacity for self-deception when removed from community and accountability.